When Google digitized its books, where did those books come from? Well, they came from libraries. So it came to be felt strongly that a library-led organization needed to steward those books, to make those books available to the students and professors and communities from which they had come. That organization is called HathiTrust. And Mike Furlough, who's going to address you next, is the executive director of HathiTrust. Now, HathiTrust now represents 190 plus libraries, academic libraries, across 230 campuses. But as he will tell you, perhaps the most profound impact of all of these millions of books online has been for those with disabilities that impact reading. So here to tell you about the impact of HathiTrust and those books is Mike Furlough.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm going to try to get my screen shared here. If you'll bear with me for 1 second. Great, awesome. So first thing I want to do is thank you, Wendy and Chris and Brewster and everyone else for extending an invitation to be here. It's really a privilege to join all of you to honor Raj Reddy and to reflect on the impact of mass digitization over the last couple of decades. I'm going to talk about how mass digitization has transformed access to collections. I'm going to talk about how this has led to some kinds of radical inclusivity, and also how it helps us understand, or can help us understand, acts of omission in our culture. When I first started in libraries about 25, almost 30 years ago, God help me, digitization was very slow going. The Million Book Project was kind of out there for us. It was like, wow, really 1 million books? But it wasn't so far removed from reality that it couldn't be inspiring. And I really appreciate being here today with someone who has helped inspire so much change over the years. First thing I want to do is just kind of highlight one fact for us. There are tens of millions of digitized books available on the internet now compared to what we had years ago. Many of these are born digital, many more are being converted from print copies. And this is really a human accomplishment. It's a human accomplishment that represents decades, if not centuries, of intellectual labor, of physical labor to steward and preserve these items so that they may eventually end up on a scanning bed and then presented to you. Before they're presented to you, there have been thousands of people who have turned billions of pages to make these books available for you to read online. And so the next time you're at Internet Archive or Google or HathiTrust, just think for a moment and thank the person who helped turn the pages so that you're able to take a look at these books today. Now, HathiTrust itself, the organization I work for, we, as Wendy said, we steward about 17.5 million digitized books, mostly from Google, but not exclusively. And we do this on behalf of the libraries that originally acquired them and made them accessible. Really, our job has been to find ways of making the results of mass digitization more useful for as many people as we can. Now, we were founded with 3 specific goals in mind. One was to create scalable scalable infrastructure that could be used to preserve digitized materials. Secondly, use that so it becomes a platform for access to make these materials relevant and accessible to support directly scholarship and education, but also general use. Works in HathiTrust are available for reading, public domain works for reading beyond the membership. And then thirdly, use that aggregation as an opportunity to tackle really big problems, really big challenges that single libraries were wrestling with and really couldn't solve on their own. So I'm going to talk about 2 of those. One is opening the library collections to sight impaired readers. And then secondly, making the collection available for computationally intensive analysis. Where I'd like to start in thinking about this, though, is to just remind you of something, that for most of our history, books were produced for a very specific audience, people who can read and people who can see. And even as literacy expanded, access for the sight impaired has more or less lagged. Even today, one of the 5 laws of library science, every person their book, simply doesn't hold true if you're blind or print disabled. There are technologies that make it possible, but the commercial marketplace has lagged behind making these available over the years. Now, this started changing about 40 years ago when digitized books started to become made available for blind readers. In the 90s, we saw the Americans with Disability Act become law. We saw the Chafee Amendment to the Copyright Act make clear that digitizing books for blind users was not a violation of copyright. But the market still did not follow, and accessible books had not been produced in significant quantities. So if you were an educational institution with an imperative to support students with a disability, you had to scan and produce your own versions for them. And this was slow going. Not only that, there were many people who had a need here. The scale was enormous. When we were founded in 2008, about just under 11% of the student population in higher education in the United States had a disability. And over almost 90% of these institutions reported having students enrolled. Now, 2 years later, in 2010, HathiTrust held about 10 million digitized works, which were then could be made available for processing for use by current disabled readers. Now, that dwarfed by a magnitude of 50 all of the books held by Learning Ally, Bookshare, National Library Service for the Blind, and others that have been formed to support these communities. So real quick, you see how mass digitization just overnight transformed or made possible more access. Now, what we did about that was to create a service that we now call the Accessible Text Request Service. We work directly with disability service experts at universities and colleges to help them get materials into the hands of their students who they understand have particular needs. They work with those students and help them understand how to use the material and the tools that they have available to them. And we do this in the United States, and we do it in Canada, the United Kingdom, and we can do it in other countries that have ratified the Marrakesh Treaty for access for published works for persons who are blind. We've also been working with our colleagues at the National Federation of the Blind to continue trying to expand this access to blind users around the country. Now, this has by no means solved the accessible book problem, but it has helped put a dent in it, and it's helped raise the visibility of the problem. But we've also had hiccups along the way. Some of these challenged our ability to do this. In 2011, we were sued. Everybody gets sued at some point, it seems like, if you're in this business. The Authors Guild challenged our ability to even create, much less store and use digitized books. Now, we won that case easily. We won it at the district court, we won it at the federal appeals court, and we won it in a way that left no doubt, right? That what we do in libraries when we scan works is serving a social purpose, and it's a social purpose that is fair use. You see here the quote from the circuit judge in our case. And I just want to say here, Brewster knows this, it sucks to be sued. It's a huge time suck. It takes a lot of energy. But in this case, we all got something out of it, because these court cases and the HathiTrust case and the Google case with Authors Guild made clear that digitization could lead to transformative uses of books, and transformative uses of books could be quintessentially fair uses. I want to thank the Authors Guild for suing us and giving us this opportunity to clarify these points for the whole world. What I want to also do then is talk about what these fair uses look like. And scholars were really chomping at the bit to get at the materials that Google was producing, that IA was producing in the first decade of this 21st century. And so that's another challenge that we felt we had to try to face in HathiTrust. Supporting machine learning and scholarly applications against the entire corpus. We started the HathiTrust Research Center in 2011. It's based at Indiana University and the University of Illinois. They offer several services, including a platform to go in and access a suite of tools that allow you to do text mining and data and some machine analysis on small parts of the corpus. If you're a power user and a really advanced researcher, we have secure computing environments where you can access any item in the collection without regard to copyright and run your analyses for your own purposes. And then we also produce secondary data sets that are available for use by anyone. These are essentially large collections of metadata at the page level about the contents of these works. Now, why do we do this? If you walk through a library and you look at the enormity of the collection, think about the heterogeneity found in that collection, you think about the wide range of authors and perspectives and subjects expressed in hundreds of languages from multiple eras, from multiple geographies. You cannot get your head around that as an individual, right? How can you find a way to help this collection tell stories about ourselves? How can we begin to wrestle with that kind of magnitude? This is the purpose of the Research Center and this kind of computational analysis. And I only have time to cite just really one example in depth because of time, but I want to take you to that right now and talk with you about the work done by Richard Jean So, who's a professor of English at McGill University. Richard really emphasizes the need to step back and look at large patterns at a large cultural scale through collections like these. In his book, Redlining Culture, he points out that there's a real history of second half of the 20th century literature, second half of the 20th century publishing that is contrary to the popular narrative. The real history, the narrative we tell ourselves in the second half of the 20th century, it's the era of civil rights, increasing multiculturalism, the rise of ethnic literature, and the acceptance of those authors. However, Richard shows that, in fact, whiteness really claimed hegemony over the publishing industry in the second half of the 20th century, just as it had before. He really upends received wisdom here. He points out that Random House, one of the most well-known commercial publishers, in the second 50 years of the last century, published only 3% of their authors were non-white. 97% of their authors were white. This has a huge impact on what people are actually reading. Richard then goes in depth looking at 1,400 novels out of the HathiTrust corpus published by Random House to do an in-depth analysis to understand how racial characteristics are discussed and portrayed. He uses a methodological approach that's known as word embeddings. He quantifies how certain modes of description and characterization become associated with ways we portray dimensions of identity in fiction. And in fact, what he finds is that in this work writ large, American white identity emerges as one that's dynamic and intellectual and creative. And that's in contrast to Blackness and other forms of identity which emerge less so, more flat, uninteresting, and at times sinister. So that's the narrative that gets told through our fiction in the second half of the 20th century while we are actively trying to change the world through our legislation and other activism. This is really depressing to read, but it's necessary work to help us understand what is at play in our collections, the collections that we're preserving and making accessible today. I want to note here towards the end that care and body has a really useful thing for us to think about in digital libraries, and that is that the scale of what we manage in our digital libraries can give the impression, a false impression, of completion and of comprehension that is actually obscuring what's not there, right? You can actually get the impression you can find anything, so you don't think about what you're not seeing. And if you think about what Richard told us and is telling us in his book, that so many works were published by white authors, you know, Random House is the kind of publisher whose works almost always get bought by libraries and end up in their collections. So what didn't make it into the publisher catalogs, and what didn't make it into the library collections, and thus what didn't make it onto the scanning beds? Not everyone has access to the means of creation and distribution of their work. The internet hasn't changed that. In fact, it's really done a lot to reinforce those barriers over the last decade in particular. Now, I don't want to end on a bummer, right? I really don't. I actually do want to say that we need to continue to push on the work that we're doing. We need to continue to work to create accessible content for impaired readers. We need to facilitate its creation where it's necessary. But as we look at digitizing the next 20 to 30 million books, I think we should ask some more questions. What aren't we digitizing? What aren't we doing instead? What are we not able to find? What are the economic or political forces that are constraining our choices? And are the corrective measures that we can take? Let's definitely celebrate the accomplishments, and let's also understand what we've done so far, who these libraries are for, what they represent, and the kinds of knowledge they may not include. So thanks very much. I look forward to talking with the rest of you for the rest of this afternoon.